And welcome. We are recording is in progress. Okay, I am Dr. Phil Hulbig, former alum of Lesley University. I am, deeply appreciative of my education here at Lesley University, and really excited to come back here and talk a little bit about what I'm doing. I thought that since, I don't know, part of the idea about this was diversity, equity, and inclusion. I thought I would start off by just sort of talking about the educational movement that I am actually trying to start related to this program. Actually, it's really related to even my PhD. I mean, the reason I went for my PhD is that, I am sort of a student with neurodiversity. I have been diagnosed with what are called comorbid learning disabilities. I don't know if anybody knows what that is, but doesn't that just sound like an absolutely horrifying thing to be diagnosed with? Okay, it just basically means that, I struggled with spelling and reading and language when I was a kid, and I was given a diagnosis of dyslexia. And then my exuberant personality sort of led them to say, you know what, maybe he also needs a diagnosis of ADHD. For me, what I'm going to be telling you about here, okay, is really in deep to my heart. Okay, this is why I'm here. I really believe that we need to start a restorative education movement. And this is kind of an idea that has come from um, some some of the work that I've done in the past. And actually, you know what? I'll paste it here in the chat. I wrote I wrote a piece that actually became like the last chapter of my book called To Be Neurodivergent. And it sort of presented this idea of what I'm now calling restorative education, because I truly believe that this metacognitive education that I'm going to be talking to you about, it's just key to restoring an individual, restoring a community, restoring a society. It's education is restorative, and we need to start thinking about it that way. And this all comes from my research, uh, which was basically trying to find a way of uniting the science with the learning that we knew about pedagogy. What that I did actually was part of my thesis here at Lesley University. I took big chunks of my research and turned it into a book, which was published by Springer Nature. And the big idea is what I'm going to share with you right here, which is the general theory of metacognitive instruction. And that really just was a general educational framework that can be used to develop pedagogies of self-authorship. Now, this research actually comes from research that I did at the Program for the Advancement of Learning in at Curry College. Um, and I interviewed some of their senior um, Pal professors, people who have basically spent their whole lives teaching metacognition, or, to be, if you're not really sure what that is, teaching students about their own learning so that they can understand how their neurodiversity is affecting their learning. For me, it was a very empowering sort of thing. What I discovered was that the main uh, pedagogy that was being used was this thing that at the time was not, like at least in my educational career, was not something that was even really talked about, but this idea of a learning conversation, which is a structured dialogue that will help students internalize this process or metacognitive process of self-questioning, getting them to really think about how they think and how they do things. And so I actually had the benefit of learning from this woman right here, who's Dr. Gertrude Webb. She was the founder of the PAL program. As I mentioned before, I'm a neurodivergent student myself. if you were going to look back at my history, the odds of me becoming a PhD would have not been something that you would have probably gambled on. But this woman right here gambled on me and brought me into her program. And I was able to learn this idea of metacognitive teaching from her. And then I was able to go on and become this thing that is called an inclusion aid. And if you don't know what an inclusion aid is, well, basically, back in the early 90s, we passed a law that said, hey, like, let's get some of these kids who we historically exclude and get them back into the public schools. And the public schools had to figure out how to get those kids in there. And so one of the ways that they did it is they took people fresh out of college like myself and they made them inclusion aides. And I worked with two students who would not have been ever even been allowed to walk through the front door of a public school. One of them was diagnosed PDD, and I really wasn't sure what the heck that was. But we know later on, okay, if you're not aware of what it just means pervasive developmental delay, and it tends to be a diagnosis marker that we usually put on young students because we don't want to diagnose them with autism right away. Um, and he was a great student. He responded to the inclusion aid model very, very well because all he really needed was a interpreter, a person who was able to sort of help connect his understanding of the world with what was really going on. He actually went on and graduated from high school and went on to college. My other student was ADHD, and I thought for sure I was going to have this kid nailed because I'm ADHD. I must know everything, right? Well, I was very, very wrong. This student was among the most difficult students I've ever had. They struggled mightily with the inclusion model. In fact, what they really needed was kind of what I'm going to be presenting here is kind of like a coaching model. They needed help with their social skills, how to plan and build those sort of things. And then, like make a game plan so when you put them into the classroom, they could be successful. And so that led to the building of these things that we call substantially separate programs. In my substantially separate program that I was given the opportunity to build in Franklin, Massachusetts was called the Therapeutic Learning Center. We were very, very successful. I had a student who came to me, like written down in his testing, does 0% of his daily work. And that student went on to become valedictorian of Franklin. He was brilliant, just like, again, struggled to express his brilliance in the classroom. And so, what I learned from teaching in these sub-separate classrooms, okay, was that if you can get students to conceptualize their learning by simply, making and testing theories about what they think is going to work, you start a process of growth and development because understanding learning equals self-control. The better you understand how you learn how you're going to respond to certain situations, the better you're going to respond, the better your self-control is, and the better you'll be able to self-advocate for yourself. And I also learned that the biggest barrier actually wasn't all of these diagnoses that we like to throw around. It was trauma. Really, the students who struggled the most were the ones that had both diagnoses and trauma. And I found that this metacognitive process works for both. And actually, I don't know if this like does if my if your closed captioning covers up part of my slide, but at least on my side, I have the little quote that I have down on the bottom, which I believe is kind of important, is this idea that learning is fundamentally problem solving. It's an idea that I'll kind of come back to in this process. But what I want to talk to you a little bit about is just this simple idea of what is metacognitive problem solving. It's a very simple metacognitive pedagogy that I'm going to leave you with, and you will be able to leave here today and practice it today. You might already find that you're already doing it, okay? Because it is based on what human beings naturally do in the learning process. It is a pedagogy of direct and purposeful instruction of problem-solving principles to help a person problem solve those problems that are affecting their own learning. In a sense, you're turning the student's ability to problem solve on the problems of their own learning. It is that reciprocal sort of aspect of metacognition. I mentioned in the title that this is going to be about holistic problem solving, which honestly, I don't have enough time to tell you about. This is the program that I've spent most of my life developing. Okay. And really, in a nutshell, what it does is it helps students who think differently, who learn differently, really conceptualize their learning without having to go into diagnoses. You can just examine their own problem-solving process and then look at their neurological functionings in those specific areas like sensing, attention, memory, because the fact of the matter is, these are not singular things. But the big idea that I learned from creating this program, which I will share with you today, is this idea of peer mentorship. Because when I was running my sub-separate classroom, one of the things that happened when I first started, I was told that, Phil, these are very rare students. You're never going to have maybe 5 or 6 of these students in a class ever. Because we just don't have these many kids in the district. Fast forward, and suddenly I have 13, 16 kids in this program. Okay, the legal limit for small group instruction in Massachusetts was 12. So we were playing all these scheduling games to try to keep kids, you know, out of the classroom and doing other sorts of things like art or speech therapy so that would be able to justify to the state that why we had more than the legal limit. Okay. And in that crucible of public education, something that tends to happen, when you tend to do something well, we tend to, in the public school system, keep putting new things on until it doesn't work so well. And this technique that I was just talking to you about is labor intensive. Honestly, the problem with metacognitive instruction is it's labor intensive. You must sit down with a student. You must talk with them. You must hear them and think about their thinking and show them how they can think about their own thinking. So, how do you do it? Okay, if you have 16 kids in your class, I was finding I couldn't do my own program and it was breaking my heart. And then one day I saw one of my eighth graders sit down with one of my newly entering sixth graders and be like, no, what are you doing? You're supposed to write it down in your you gotta, you gotta use your binder like this and write it. And I was like, holy smokes, he is showing him how to use a binder. So, I motioned to my aide, and pretty soon, like we were recreating the way this classroom was run, having those students who had gone through the program and really understood this idea of metacognitive problem solving, this idea of looking at your own learning and applying what they knew as a mentor to a younger peer. This did two things. First off, it freed up my time, but it also it improved their regulation also. They developed leadership skills and just generally it transformed the classroom because again, this is what we back in the day what they called a emotional behavioral substantially separate classroom. Still, like to this day, like I'm so glad we're starting to move away from a lot of these kind of terminologies. But I mean, that is the way we were looked at. And um, many of these kids just had never had an opportunity to be a leader. And giving them that opportunity, they just came out of their shell. And so I wanted to briefly sort of mention the science because I think the science is very, very profound, especially when you realize it, when you start looking at the science from an interdisciplinary approach. So I just wanted to mention a couple of people that you really, if you don't know who these people are because they are not in the field of education, you should look into them. One is a man right here he's a local. He's actually at MIT. His name is Mike Levin, and he studies cellular intelligence. And basically what he has discovered is that problem solving is kind of at the base of what we even consider a living thing. In fact, he is developing a new way to classify, like we have historically been unable to find that dividing line between what makes something living and what makes something non-living. And he is coming with a definition that's based on problem solving, that is based on, in other words, we're looking at structures that have an ability to solve a problem. Now, it might just be a metabolistic sort of thing. So the problem solving that's occurring is in a very narrow range. But then that metabolism can get absorbed into the cell. And next thing you have a cell that has an even wider um, problem solving space. And then when you get to humans, well, look at us, we have this unbelievable problem solving space. And that's why I put David Deutsch down here, because David Deutsch, I believe, and I want to just really encourage, like say this, because he's a computer physicist. Okay, he's the guy who has basically written the operating system for quantum computers. And he um, has created a wonderful mathematical explanation of human choice problem solving space, which he believes is infinite. And he believes it's infinite based on the idea of what's called a Turing machine or a computer. And most people don't, if you don't know what a Turing machine, I'll be very quick, but a Turing machine is just basically a computer that moves a piece of paper back and forth in two-dimensional space. Okay, and it can solve every single type of computational problem in two-dimensional space. David Deutsch proposes that we are a three-dimensional sort of version of this. Like we have a three-dimensional sort of Turing style operating system where we do a very, very simple procedure that we call problem solving. And that problem solving is very, very simply just making a prediction and then error correcting that prediction. This is profound when you know the data about from people who are actually working with kids, psychologists and particularly educators, like Stroll and Lesley. The child scientist theory has basically proven what David Deutsch has said. No matter how young you go with children, you will find that they are always using the exact same problem-solving procedure that Albert Einstein used, that any scientist used, that if you are a PhD student right now, it's the one you're using. They make a prediction, they test that prediction, and then they improve it. So, they hold out the cup and say, gee, if I dump it out, mom might get mad. They dump it out, mom gets mad, prediction correct. They remember not to dump things out. Okay, but this also feeds into what we know are some of the best teaching approaches, like project-based learning, and these kinds of things. And I don't know how I'm doing on time, but the evidence for the power of mentorship is simply overwhelming. And if you get anything out of this lecture right here, okay, if you're not sure about what I'm really getting into around when I'm talking about this metacognitive problem solving sort of thing, just this, if you can get this one message about mentorship, it is quite possibly the most powerful thing. And if you stop and think about it, to kind of go with my spiel, okay, it is literally the most natural way that humans learn. If you close your eyes and you try to imagine what would the first teacher have looked like, not the first teacher in a school, not a first teacher even a agricultural society, as far back as you can possibly imagine, into the Stone Age and beyond, what would that first teacher have looked like? He would have looked like, or she would have looked like a mentor, another person who knows a little bit more and is willing to spend the time with you and help you develop that skill. Um, so what I'm sharing here today, I feel you can start tomorrow. Okay. I can encourage you, like my program, actually, the way I've built it, okay, can be used with like one student. Okay, it can be done in an entire classroom like I was doing it back in Franklin. I have since written it so that it can even be used across an entire team in a school. And this is where the movement comes in. I am hoping that I can start pushing this thing and get school districts to realize that, in this age of AI, what we really want to start building now is mentorship programs that keep kids humanly connected. Because these AI programs, they're wonderful. but they don't have the power on their own to get kids to learn. We already have the scientific data on that. And guess what it was? It was COVID. If all of these things worked so well, kids should have had an explosion in their abilities when everything moved online, and that just didn't happen. Okay. And that should be a cautionary tale for what we're thinking AI is going to do, because AI has tremendous potential as a person with neurodiversity. It's like a prosthetic for certain types of problem solving that in the past might have been something that, we wouldn't have been I don't know, able to offer something like a calculator for. But anyway, I'll come back to this. The idea is that you can pick even one, start with one student, okay? And it doesn't need to be your best student. It just needs to be a student who is willing to answer this key question that what are the problems you are facing in your learning, and how might we solve them together? If you have a student who is willing to really seriously answer that question, okay, that's the one you want to start this program with. And then you just want to teach them that simple prediction, error correction loop applied to themselves. If I keep a to-do list, okay, then I might get things done. Test that prediction, see what happens. Okay, refine that approach over time. Once students start realizing that this problem solving sort of thing, it becomes very, very powerful. And I believe that this isn't just a fluke. It is based on the research. If you follow the metacognitive research, the first metacognitive researcher who really coined the term metacognition was this guy named John Flavel. And he saw metacognition as these two qualities. One quality was metacognitive knowledge. That's everything that you know about knowing. Okay. And metacognitive regulation, which is your ability to do it. But that's very, you'll notice that that's very objective and stagnant. He was then followed by Nelson and Lorenz, who are neuroscientists, who wanted to like find out, well, what is this actively? And we can scan the brain and see what the brain is doing actively when it is doing metacognition. And you can do that. There's plenty of research. I'm actually about to hopefully publish a paper in Frontiers about this exact sort of phenomenon. And you have this one type of active consciousness, which is inward facing. Okay, your abstract consciousness, when you close your eyes and you imagine in your head, that's one kind of consciousness. But you also have another kind of metacognitive consciousness, which is subjective, outwardly focused, goal focused. What, like, hopefully right now, your subjective, okay, metacognitive consciousness is on me right now. But if you think about these two models, they fit perfectly with this problem solving sort of thing. If you're going to make predictions about what's happening in the world, you need to reflect upon your experience with that world, and that becomes your prediction phase. And then once you start actually implementing, that's your regulation phase. Can you error correct and make that response better? Um, and I do, like, I think I made this point a little bit earlier, but if we can't teach our students to start self-authoring their own lives, other people are going to start doing it for them. And this is a scary part of the time that we live in. I mean, there are entire industries right now that profit from understanding how we learn and then putting stuff out there to influence our thinking. Our students right now face an unprecedented amount of information manipulation. Without proper metacognitive skills and problem-solving skills, they run the risk of being quite victimized by, public relations and many of those sorts of things. So uh, the big idea is that we're moving this. I'm moving from theory to practice, and that's why I'm presenting this not just as a an educational technique, but an educational movement. Okay, because I see it as we're moving forward. We've started with the teacher as the sage on the stage. We have moved to this idea that this teacher is sort of a supportive guide, helping that student learn. And I want to encourage people to start thinking about this next level, which is the teacher as a problem-solving partner, a person who's going to help move that student through their learning and help them learn about their learning, this becomes transformative. And I can say that for myself because as a person with ADD and dyslexia, it wasn't until somebody actually sat down with me and said, "No, you're not stupid." And actually, the most profound thing was said by my pal professor, who said, "Phil, nobody is going to understand your ADD or your dyslexia better than you. So study it." Okay. And if you can get students to start doing that, you see tremendous explosions in their ability to manage themselves. And if you can get them to build that skill, reinforce that learning by teaching another student, not only does it build their self-esteem, but it builds that young student. I mean, I had this phenomenon in my classroom where the we started making these big uh paper mache hockey, like the Stanley Cup style hockey cups for all the students who had worked their way completely out of sub-separate. Okay. Like at the time I was doing it, they didn't even have a name for it. We were calling it, these kids worked their way back into regular special education. How confusing does that sound? But that's what they were doing. Okay. And it was partly because of this, they would come back and we would give them this cup and we would promote them as, now you are, a master learner, a master mentor for the students in the class. So when we teach students to work collaboratively to address the problems that impede their educational development, they form meaningful connections that support both academic and emotional resilience. And that really is the big idea. So some more references. Thank you all. And is there any questions I can answer for anybody?
Hi, Phil. This is Gloria. Thank you so much. This was really powerful, and in understanding our students' learning and how we can help them to better see and improve with their own agency. I'm wondering, in your experience, have you seen this working better in specific disciplines? Like it works more effectively when teaching art or when teaching a science project or when teaching math? I'm curious.
Well, part of what I want to get people to start thinking about is separating your subject-based knowledge from your problem-solving based knowledge. That the subject that you're teaching is like the medium that you're using to teach this problem solving, this self-development problem solving approach. So I think it can be done through any kind of medium. And one thing that I didn't talk about in this presentation, but maybe you can, if this strikes your interest, here's a fun presentation that I haven't talked on in a while. But one of the reasons why my ankle is broken is I teach kids how to skateboard. I teach therapeutic skateboarding. I actually call it metacognitive skateboarding. And essentially, what I'm doing is I'm teaching this exact problem-solving process, but only in relation to skateboarding. But then what I do is sort of, oh, notice how you made predictions and you problem solve that. Well, guess what? You can do that now with your artwork, your reading, you know what I'm saying? Encouraging them because these are transferable skills. I mean, not to get too much into the weeds of like the difference between metacognition and self-regulation, which is a fun rabbit hole to go down if you're an educator. But, like metacognitive skills are transferable. They are the ones that you can bring from one style of problem solving to another. And these are things like organizing your work before you start. So I believe in terms of like having a lot of research on this, that's kind of where I'm hoping and I'm heading. And if you are a teacher who is working with students, and I've encouraged you to maybe even try this with a student, please keep in touch with me and let me know. It could become part of some of my future research here because I do want to find out um, how well this works outside of students with special education. Like for me, the data for this program that I presented you comes primarily from working with students who have neurodiversity and trauma. And so um, I believe that since it works with them, it should be widely replicatable. Okay. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. I hope that answers your question.
It did beautifully. Thank you. And I was wondering if you could go back to the slide that basically your infographic that surmises your entire work. Uh,
Okay. The whole holistic problem solving.
yes, yes, that one. And I'm curious, if you can, um, I'm just curious about these sort of input phases, processing phases, and output phases, because the high touch that you're talking about in order to do this work with a student to see them thrive, um, there isn't and can't be a timeline on it. It's when it happens, it happens. But I'm curious, as they go through this phase, like, are they spending more time in the input, in the processing, in the output?
Well, a
I'm
big
just curious.
piece of what this diagram is a way to help students visualize what's going on when they're learning. And so, in a lot of ways, what it is it's an overlay of everything that I've learned about neurology in learning, overlaid with everything that I've learned about problem solving.
Mm.
So, in the very heart of this is really the core, which is like you'll notice this is the one that I've been trying to focus everybody on. At the core, problem solving can be reduced as long as you're not trying to make it scientific. Okay. In other words, you're just using it for problem solving. You're just making predictions and you are just error correcting. Okay. And so, like at the very most base level of this, like in a way to think about it, I have done this program with students from first grade to college level. Okay. So my first grade students, a lot of this stuff, I'm not even showing them. I'm just focusing doggedly on let's make a prediction. Let's check out how that prediction went. How would we error correct it to make a better prediction? And that right there in a nutshell starts the process. But then we know that this problem solving process exists in a field of time. So you're going to have an input phase, you're going to have a processing phase, and you're going to have an output phase, and this right there is again a metaphorical way, like all of this is sort of using, this visual metaphor to help bring up these abstract ideas about problem solving that would be very, very difficult to bring up otherwise. You could point it out, but it's like using a social story with a person who is on the autistic spectrum. The social story keeps the schema that you're kind of talking about. Like most students don't really intrinsically understand an input phase, processing phase, output phase. They might understand it as beginning, middle, and end. Okay. But you can fold that, and then you can start saying, well, when you are in the input phase and you are trying to get something into your head, what are you doing? You're using your senses, you're using your attention, and you're using your memory. This also gives me like other ways of like explaining sort of interesting concepts like if you don't sense something, it doesn't exist to you. If you don't pay attention to it, it doesn't exist to you. If you don't remember it, okay, it's never going to make it around the corner here into the processing phase for you to think about. So like you've got to get it around this corner here. And then, like it's nice to know that in the thinking phase, I can basically break down the processing phase, which seems like there's a million different things going on into just these three nice categories. And then when you are finally got a metaphor that you can explain to yourself about the problem solving that you've just done, well, now you make a judgment of it and you do it. And then once you do it, you're in the sense making phase, and there's sort of your uh, metacognitive reflective phase where you're doing your big error correction. And the reason there's this little tiny T truth up here, okay, is because part of that process is to find what I call tiny T truths, not like grand answers to like, the deepest questions in the world, but like small questions or small things that you can take that are going to help you next time. Like, gee whiz, when I write things down on in a to-do list, I actually get more things done. or maybe I need to, like stop listening to music because I like end up singing along with it and not getting the work done. Like these tiny T truths then become part of your, they get re-entered into the input phase. And so this becomes a mechanism to really start talking about these abstract features of learning. Okay, and then the other piece that I'm working on, and I don't know if I'll share it here. There's PhDs who are interested, but like part of what I'm trying to do is create a non medicalized form that allows people to sort of define and, for lack of a better word, diagnose their own neurodiversity without having to have their neurodiversity placed in some sort of medicalized label. They can just look at something like this and say, you know what, I have certain weaknesses, maybe in intention, but I have these amazing strengths in, say, judgment and creation. Okay, and as part of this, the holistic problem solving process, what I do when I'm working directly with students and we're doing this particular, we're like literally trying to create, specialized interventions that are going to work for certain specialized situations based on their knowledge of their own learning profile, regardless of whatever they've been diagnosed with. Um, so I hope that answers any other questions on that or.
No, that was really helpful. Thank you.
We do have one question in the chat from Christina who mentioned missing a big part of your presentation and if the slides would be available for people to view later.
Yeah, sure. I think we're recording this, right? And
Yes.
you can even watch the whole thing later. But yeah, I'll share the slides, absolutely.
Um, Dr. Holbig, I really appreciated your um, inclusion and push for mentorship in terms of like supporting students. And you talked earlier about your desire to bring your work into other like school systems around the country. What do you see as some of the barriers, like say in like maybe like the K through 12 school system compared to higher ed institutions?
Well, I can tell you what the barriers are because I've already started doing it. I've been out there. The number one barrier is who pays for it,
Mm.
and so, like, I've had very positive reception, I mean, because who am I? I'm coming out of nowhere. Okay. Like it's, it's just simply because, like, I've done my own procedure in a way of like, but many of the places, and actually I feel like you can even see it right now if you look at the general um movements in education. There is a lot of movement right now towards mentorship. People are really starting to realize that mentorship is a thing. And so, I feel like I'm a little bit ahead on that curve because what makes a good mentor, is, always a difficult question. One of the ways I'm trying to get around this weakness of, who pays for it, okay, is that it is kind of what I'm doing here right now. Um, in my private practice, for example, have started applying this with my private students. So kids come to me to in a lot of ways they're there because they're neurodiverse and they need help in school, but now I'm showing them how they learn, and then once I get them to a certain level, I start pairing them with new students that I'm working with, and they become a mentor just in that private capacity. In the like more, I don't know how to explain this, but like what I'm doing right now is trying to reach out to teachers like yourself and say, here's the thing that I'm doing. Okay, if you would like to learn, like I guess, go to my website, like, and I offer consultations for teachers also, because if you are a lone teacher out there, and that's why I've set this up sort of the way it is, you can start this program on your own. And what I'm hoping to do in the next year is just start using my Substack and some this social media is kind of create a external support group for people who are trying to use this program in whatever capacity they're doing in their individual teaching process. But if you can get two people, okay, in other words, it's you and the person next door to you, you're on a team maybe. Well, now you can cross-pollinate. Maybe one teacher, like if you're the sixth grade teacher and you have a fifth grade teacher underneath you, okay, you can train your students to do this, like your sixth grade students to be these mentors for the fifth graders. And then those fifth graders learn how to be the mentors, and then they come into that sixth grade class, and then they become the mentors of the mentees. Not only does that free up a lot of, because now you have a class that's got this um, wonderful support mechanism. You increase the capacity of your classroom. I mean, that was one of the things that like kind of floored me was I actually, had, at this moment where I had 16 kids and how do I keep this all together? Okay, was suddenly finding that I could keep it together because the kids were helping me keep it together. And this is profound for me. It's what sent me to Lesley University because I'm working with the kids who are supposed to have the emotional behavioral problems. They're not supposed to be able to do these kinds of things. And here they are, they're doing it. If you're not working with those kind of kids, I think it's going to be a real boon. Okay. And if maybe I can get two teachers doing this, well, maybe their principal will see it. And then you guys can call me in and we can do this at like I feel like this program the way at least I have it set up is perfectly positioned for middle school, high school, and freshmen in college. At Curry College, we're working right now, or I'm working very hard to get everybody in administration to understand that we at Curry College could be offering every single student who comes to Curry a metacognitive mentor, a trained metacognitive mentor in their freshman year. And in their sophomore year, we can offer every single student who wants it the opportunity to be a metacognitive mentor and have that leadership experience. Okay. And you can do that at the college level. You can do that at the high school level. You can do that at the middle school level. And again, this is why I think this is a movement. Okay, because if we all of a sudden start getting, middle schools to do this, and so every fifth grader that comes in gets an eighth grader who's going to mentor them, okay, or even a sixth grader. I mean, like, it doesn't have to be that far apart, but the same, and then they go on and they go into high school, and then they have that same experience again. Well, by the time they get into college, okay, these are kids who have been not only are deeply understanding of their learning, but deeply understanding of the learning of others, deeply understanding of how we create learning communities. Okay, well, suddenly what they're going to be able to achieve in college, okay, is going to be exponential. If I can be so bold, well, maybe we can start getting some of these corporations and businesses and other people to start thinking about like, rather than, what I see in education that happens all the time, what happened in my specific program is the person like myself leaves and no attempt is made to do a handoff. And even when that person like myself is there saying, I'm here, I will, reach out to me when you need to, it doesn't happen because it's hard. It's not built into the system. But if we can start thinking about that, we've got ourselves a real educational revolution on our hands. And, and it's like when you think about what the power of things like AI are going to allow people to do, okay, this becomes, I believe, even more important, imperative. And so I guess if anybody is interested in doing this, please let me know. Reach out, let me know. I can give any support in starting it up because I mean we are at the beginning stages right here, but like I see this as a compounding movement, you know. I've got students right now who are mentoring students, and in a few more years, those students will be mentoring, and it'll just grow exponentially from here.